On the second day, the machine seemed to glitch. A man who hadn't said a word out loud in years had just spoken, out loud, in his own voice. He said, "I'm looking for a cheetah." The researchers froze. It had to be an error. Until his little girl walked into the room, wearing a cheetah onesie. He wasn't malfunctioning. He was playing along. That's how the New York Times reported it. His name is Casey Harrell. He's a climate activist, a husband, a father. Around 2020, a disease called ALS began taking his voice, one slurred word at a time until it was gone. In the scientific papers, he isn't named. He's just T15. And the very first time the system worked, his lead researcher described the room like this, quote, "He cried with joy as the words he was trying to say correctly appeared on screen. We all did." Casey is the same man at the heart of three of the most astonishing experiments in modern medicine. One implant in his brain. And across 2 years, it took him from typing with his mind to speaking in his own voice in 1/40th of a second, to something that sounds like science fiction. Something that unsettled even the people who built it. But first, one thing, and it matters more at the end than you'd think. This is not mind reading. It cannot hear your private thoughts. Every word it caught, Casey was trying to say. Remember that. Because the same scientists who learned to read the voice inside a paralyzed man's head also proved that voice can leak out. So they did something no one had done before. They built a lock. A password, you think? This is the story of how an AI learned to hear the voice inside a silenced man's head, and the lock built to keep it his. To understand what's happening inside Casey's head, forget brains for a second, and picture a phone call. When you speak, your motor cortex, the part of the brain that controls movement, fires off a rapid stream of commands to about 100 muscles. The lips, the tongue, the jaw, the voice box. That's all speech really is. Choreography. In ALS, or after a stroke deep in the brainstem, the wiring downstream breaks. The muscles stop listening. But here's the haunting part. The brain keeps sending the commands anyway. Casey was shouting into a disconnected phone line. So the scientists tapped the line. They placed tiny arrays of electrodes onto the speech region of his brain and eavesdropped. Not on his thoughts, but on those outgoing motor commands his muscles could no longer hear. Then an AI learned to turn that signal back into words. And here's the elegant part. The AI doesn't memorize whole words. There are far too many. Instead, it learns 39 basic sounds, the building blocks of English. Ch, sh. Think of them like Lego bricks. With 39 bricks, you can build almost any word, even ones the system has never seen, reaching a vocabulary of 125,000 words. The first proof that this could be fast came in 2023, with a woman named Pat Bennett, also living with ALS. As she tried to speak, her brain signal was decoded into text at 62 words a minute. That's about 3.5 times the old record, closing in on real conversation, around 160 words a minute. Fast was solved. Now they had to make it sound human. And there isn't just one way to do this. Some teams sink tiny needles into the brain itself. Others rest a thin grid on its surface. Different tools, different trade-offs. Which becomes the whole race in a moment. It is not all the same chip. In 2024, Casey's team at UC Davis hit a milestone that stopped neuroscientists cold. The very first time they switched his system on, within minutes, it read his attempted speech as text, with 99.6% accuracy on a small set of words. Open it up to the full vocabulary, and it still landed around 90%. Minutes, not months of training. Minutes. But text on a screen isn't a voice, so they did something more intimate. They rebuilt his actual pre-ALS voice from old home recordings and had the system read his words aloud in it. As his neurosurgeon, David Brandman, put it, "Our voice is part of what makes us who we are." Then, In June 2025, the real leap, from typing to talking. A new system synthesized his speech continuously, out loud, with a delay of about 25 milliseconds, 1/40th of a second. And suddenly, he could do the things a keyboard never can. Raise his pitch to ask a question, lean on a word for emphasis, make up a word that doesn't exist, even hum a melody. Listeners understood about 60% of what the synthesizer said. Without it, they understood 4%. He wasn't alone. At UC San Francisco, a woman named Ann Johnson got something just as moving. A teacher and coach, she'd been locked inside her body for some 18 years after a brainstem stroke in her late 20s. Her system drove a digital avatar that could speak and even show expressions at around 80 words a minute. And her synthesized voice? They rebuilt it from her wedding video audio. Hearing it, she said, it's like hearing an old friend. But every one of these breakthroughs demanded the same thing: effort. The exhausting, physical work of trying to speak. Which raised a strange, almost unsettling question. What if you didn't have to try at all? In August 2025, a team led out of Stanford answered it. For the first time, they decoded inner speech, words a paralyzed person only imagined, with no attempt to move. As one of the researchers said, if you just have to think about speech instead of actually trying to speak, it's potentially easier and faster. Why is that so much harder than it sounds? Because imagining a word lights up the motor cortex in a much weaker version of actually trying to say it. It's a whisper of the same pattern, and a whisper is harder to hear. So let's be honest about the numbers, because this is exactly where it's easy to oversell. You might see a headline that the system reached up to 74% accuracy. That figure comes from the press release. The best participant, choosing from an open vocabulary of 125,000 words, which still means about 1 word in 4 came out wrong. In the paper itself, for one participant, imagined speech scored around 73%, against 98% for speech they actually attempted. Inner speech is real. It is also clearly harder. And this is a proof of concept, not a product. It takes brain surgery. It takes electrodes implanted in the cortex. And when the researchers tried to decode totally free-form thinking, just letting the mind wander, the result was, in their words, largely gibberish. This does not read your daydreams. But here's the part that gave even the scientists a chill. Because attempted and imagined speech overlap, a system built for one can accidentally pick up the other. In one test, a participant was asked to silently count, and the decoder could partly follow along, tracking a private number they were only thinking, far beyond chance. A microphone, you might say, that you didn't know was on. Hold that image, it comes back. It feels brand new and a little frightening, but the dream underneath it is 100 years old. It started with something far simpler than a brain implant. The first letterboards appeared in the 1920s. For a child who couldn't speak, the only way out was to spell, one painstaking letter at a time. In 1995, the editor of French Elle magazine, Jean-Dominique Bauby, had a stroke deep in his brainstem. He woke able to move just one thing, his left eyelid. And with it, blinking, one letter at a time as an assistant read the alphabet aloud, he dictated an entire book. It took something like 200,000 blinks, roughly 2 minutes per word. That was the state of the art. Find any flicker of movement and turn it into spelling. Even the most famous voice on earth was painfully slow. Stephen Hawking spoke at about 15 words a minute, clicking a switch in his hand, and as his ALS advanced, that fell to roughly 1 word a minute, triggered by a twitch of his cheek. Natural speech runs about 150 words a minute. Every brilliant tool we built for him was still, at heart, a faster way to spell. Then, in 1998, the hinge. A physician named Phil Kennedy put a brain implant in a locked-in Vietnam veteran named Johnny Ray, who learned to move a cursor and spell his name. Not by moving a muscle, but by imagining moving his hand. The press called him the world's first cyborg. And buried in that story was the idea that would change everything. decode the intention, not the muscle. In 2006, a team called BrainGate, the very scientific lineage Casey's implant belongs to, let a young man with a spinal cord injury move a cursor, open his email, and control a television by thought alone. And in 2021, surgeons at UCSF decoded the first full words from a paralyzed man's brain, about 15 a minute. Slow, like Hawking's clicker. But for the first time, the words came from the brain, not a keyboard. For 100 years, every leap was a better spelling tool. Blink, click, type, predict. AI is the first to skip the spelling entirely and reconstruct the voice itself. Which is exactly what makes that leak so dangerous, and what they did about it. Which brings us back to that leak. The same 2025 study that proved inner speech can be read also proved it can escape. When that participant counted silently, the system quietly followed, a private monologue slipping out. So the researchers did something this field had almost never done. In the very same paper that found the problem, they built the fix. They taught the decoder to stay shut, to ignore your inner speech completely, until you choose to unlock it, with a password you think. Their demo phrase was chitty chitty bang bang. The system recognized it almost 99% of the time. The fix was built into the same study as the flaw, so the person, not the machine, decides when it listens. And this is moving fast. Neuralink just had a man with ALS narrate a whole video in a clone of his own voice. Synchron, paradromics, and precision are racing too, some far less invasive. Sam Altman's startup, Merge Labs, is betting it can read the brain with ultrasound. No implant at all. But be clear-eyed. Every one of these is still experimental. Not one is a product you can go buy. And the rules are being written right now, while the tech is still young. Chile wrote neuro rights into its constitution in 2021. 4 US states, starting with Colorado, now protect your neural data. But here's the catch. Those laws were written for consumer gadgets, not the medical implants in this story. We're still figuring this out as we go. And that is the whole point. The technology was never the danger. The danger was always who holds the key. And for the first time, the people building it made sure that's still us. Casey Harrell types with his mind. He speaks in his own voice in 1/40th of a second. And now, when he's too tired to try, he can simply imagine the words. On the second day, he turned to his young daughter and said, as it was reported, "Sweet daughter of mine, I have been waiting for this for a long time." For generations, we built faster ways to spell. Now, we've learned to listen to the voice inside. The only question left is the one we still get to answer ourselves. What we choose to do with it.